This conference is now being recorded.
Welcome to the New York State Association of School Business Officials webinar. Today's program is Purchasing Essentials. Your host for today is Donna Clement, Director of Professional Development with New York State ASBO. Operator assistance is available at any time during this conference by pressing £0. A question and answer session will follow the presentation. You may send chat questions during the presentation using the chat window indicated by a speech bubble icon located to the right of the presentation. Please address chat questions to the Q&A group using the drop-down list located at the bottom of the chat window. Without further ado, I will now turn the call over to our host. Donna, please begin.
Thank you, Michelle, and welcome everyone to Purchasing Essentials. This is going to be a very interesting program, and glad so many of you have decided to be part of it. We have Mark Coleman, who's the Director of Operations at Orange Ulster BOCES, and Angela Pierce. She's the School Business Manager with Syosset Central School District. Steve Zontner, who was going to participate, has developed the flu, we think, but he will certainly be on our next webinar, which is March 15. And those of you who are participating in the online course, after today's webinar, you want to go to the NIASBA website, click on the conference room that's on the left side of the home page, go to the Purchasing online course, and the activity for you to complete will be there. And right now I'm going to have Mark take over and begin our webinar. Mark, it's all yours.
Great, thanks, Donna. Welcome, everybody. Just before the television show starts, there's all kinds of trouble. So we had multiple computer crashes and things of that nature, but we're here and we're operational. So again, welcome everybody. This will be kind of a basic overview of Purchasing Essentials and the laws and the policies, exactly what the description in the ASBO pamphlets talked about. And then the next two sessions will be a little more in depth on some of the issues that are facing you all. So if there are any questions, you may email them in the chat area. I'm not seeing what you're seeing, but I'm assuming there's an area where you can type in questions. If they're pertinent to the topic we're on at the time, I'll go ahead and address them. Otherwise, we'll wait till the end and we'll address them then. So let's get started. The first question I want to ask, and for lay people, this is a good question because they don't understand the processes that we all have to follow. So I'll assume everybody online is either a purchasing agent or a business manager or something to do with the business office. Whether you're new or whether you're experienced, this is going to be a good review for you. But what I ask a lot of people when I do a presentation, and especially when it's lay people, again, I say, what happens when we don't procure stuff properly? And if there's any of my districts that are listed on this slide, these are actual headlines from the local newspaper, the Middletown Times-Herald Record. I did put BOCES, our own BOCES, up there, so I hope I don't offend anyone if your district is up there. But these are actual headlines that I went through and picked out based on the newspaper's view of what's happened in the districts based on controllers' audits. And in a later webinar, we'll get into controllers' audits and some of the things that the controller looks for and seems to target. So to talk to the lay people, maybe they don't understand until they see this. When we don't buy stuff properly, this is the result. You see ours, controllers' audit, false BOCES purchasing practices. It was the BOCES is very, very clean financially, but probably every district and every municipality across the state could improve on their purchasing. And they did find a lot of stuff was minor, but still, when it hits the newspaper, the public starts saying, well, there goes those school districts again, blowing our money or not doing the right thing. And the public, they get upset when they see their tax dollars wasted, especially with school districts, because we are the largest tax burden they have, and especially in today's economy and with all that's going on in the districts. So that usually wakes some people up and has them start paying attention. And probably just about everybody on this call has had some sort of experience with the controller or the result of an audit of some sort. So what do we do? What do we do to make sure we don't have those headlines? We look at these laws that really are our Bible, especially 103 and 104. If you look at the screen, are really our Bible for purchasing. So we really need to know, if you don't have the McKinney's books, somehow get copies of the laws and make sure you stay updated with all these laws, because they do change from time to time. We just had a major change in 103 recently that we'll go over later. But we need to know these laws. You need to review these laws. You need to look at the case law that's printed in the McKinney's books, so that you understand how generally case law is developed as a result of some sort of issue that may be a vendor who didn't receive an award. He went after a municipality or or an entity, and you see what the facts of the case were and how the judges sided. So it's always good to read those things, and it's important to your job, so you're doing the right thing. No guarantee, though, that if you follow everything in the law, that the controller or the internal or external auditor won't find anything, and that's their job, frankly. So that's bound to happen. So we'll start quickly with some of the laws. New York State Department of Labor laws. Prevailing wage is a big one. And we'll go over it in detail in a little while, but it has to do with anytime you do a public work project. So, we'll define public work as well later, but it's basically anytime you have some kind of service, either a building service or a construction type service, including fuel oil delivery. In case you didn't know that, I bet you a lot of people on the call now, and it's unfortunate that I don't get to interact with you to figure it out, but very little known fact that fuel oil delivery is a public work. It's in Article 9. And again, we'll elaborate on that stuff both later today and in future conferences. But it requires you to file for a prevailing wage schedule with the Department of Labor. And then most of the time you have to receive certified payrolls before you can pay the bills. And the second is Wick's Law, which is it can be found in General Municipal Law 101. And there's somebody that doesn't have any sound. Hopefully the technicians can see that. 207 and 209. So just minutes ago I have two folks who say they don't have any sound. Wick's Law, which requires you, depending on what part of the state you're in, to separate your contracts for large building projects. And again, we'll go over that later in one of the later conferences. Then there's local laws, which are important. Administrative memoranda, if your district uses those. I know there are some districts whose superintendent or the superintendent's group issue what's called administrative memoranda, which may direct future activities in a certain way. I know the BOCES doesn't use administrative memoranda. We use mostly Board of Education policy. And we'll see one of our policies later on, which is specific to, it's the purchasing policy, the most important one, which is required by General Municipal Law, Section 104B. And that should, 103 and 104B, if you're in purchasing, those two laws, you should know pretty much what they cover. You should know them like the back of your hand. So, again, the board policy, which we'll go over in a few minutes, is probably the most important within your district besides the state statutes. So now we'll start with General Municipal Law 103. And GML 103 covers, it defines bidding. It's really the Bible of procurement, so to speak. And the most familiar requirement of General Municipal Law 103 are the thresholds. These thresholds, not the ones you see, the 10,000 for commodities and then the 20,000 for public works, were established in '93 and weren't changed until the last several months, when the 20,000 public work limit was raised to 35,000. But let me caution you that even though the limit was raised to 35,000, you really have to go back and address your 104B policy to make sure that it reflects the 35,000. Because if your policy still says 20, then your policy is 20. So just because the state changed the limit to 35, don't get caught in that little trap that you can now do 35. Make sure you change your board policy to reflect the new state policy. In fact, we have to do that ourselves. Okay, General Municipal Law 103 requires advertising in your official newspaper or newspapers, and they're designated usually annually at your reorg meeting by your Board of Education. Of course, the big one there is 5 days shall elapse between publication and bid opening, and the 5 days is a short period of time for a bid opening from the time of publication. It's hardly time enough for people to get on board, read the advertisement, and submit paperwork. So, rule of thumb I like to use in the BOCES is at least 30 days, because that gives people sufficient time to, gather up their information, reach out to you for questions if there are any, and time to clarify, and also time for you to make adjustments if you do discover that you made a mistake in your specs maybe and it needs to be changed. So it helps you to not have to go out and re-advertise and do all of that administrative work again. So it's good. It's law, but it's a good rule of thumb to go a little longer. GML 103 also requires a record of all the bid pricing, so you have to create an abstract. Usually done in Excel. It can be very simple, but it should have who the bidder is, where they're from, and create a record of their pricing. And also requires a public bid opening and reading. And those of you who have even done this for a couple of weeks have probably been involved with a bid reading and opening. In fact, our new purchasing manager for the BOCES, Chris Palazzi is his name, started on Monday and had his first 2 bid openings yesterday, so we broke him in right away. And there is a question about how many days you have to run the ad, and the law doesn't state how many days, it just says you have to advertise, so 1 day is appropriate, which is what we do. As long as it's there and it appears in all of your official newspapers. And if you have more than one official newspaper, the rule is generally from the first publication in the first newspaper it hits is your 5 days. It's a little unusual. Well, I shouldn't say unusual, but in this area there are some larger papers. We have 1 official newspaper. I know the county that we're in uses 5 official newspapers, and that's for more political reasons, so that each of the legislators kind of have their districts covered. So that works as well. Okay, GML 103 also allows for piggybacking off of a county contract. It used to be a county that was touching your county, and now it has been changed. A couple of years back, it was changed to any county contract in New York State. So if you find a contract from another area that is let by a county, and they actually write in there that you can piggyback, or it allows piggybacking, you can go ahead and use that. But it must employ the same terms and conditions. So in other words, there's no extras. They can't add shipping or additional items that weren't included in the bid, or price increases because you're in a different part of the state. It needs to be exactly the same.
Mark?
Yes.
It's Angela. I'd also like to just add to that in terms of the T&Cs that the county may have, there should also be a clause that allows political subdivisions to use that contract, because without that clause, I think there's some law that indicates that would mean you weren't allowed to use it as a subdivision.
That's correct. They have to write that into the spec. So clearly, it's best to always talk to somebody if you're going to use their contract and make sure that's all covered. You can negotiate a lower price from that county contract. That's probably the only change that wouldn't be frowned upon. But if you were able to negotiate a lower price, certainly that would be acceptable. General GML 103 talks about where they accept emergency situations. So the rule of thumb in the law is must be a threat to public building, property, or life, safety, or health. Here, there's an example my boss uses when we go out and talk, and she had a roof that was leaking over a gymnasium, and couldn't get it declared an emergency because they knew that this roof was deteriorating, and they didn't act upon it, and they couldn't get roof replacement declared as an emergency, whether it was through SCD or whoever she spoke to, because it was something that they should have and could have foreseen. So if it's something you should have and could have foreseen and just didn't plan properly for, you can't consider it an emergency. So an emergency is a real emergency. So I would always, especially if it's a much larger dollar amount, flip that to your attorney and have him or her decipher that for you. Because poor planning, if somebody forgot to order, whatever supplies for a party that the schools have, and that's not an emergency, certainly. Okay. There's another exception which isn't on the slide, and it's a standardization clause. Wouldn't necessarily exempt you from bidding, but it would allow you to restrict your specifications. Your board has to pass standardization clause by 3/5 of the entire board. It's got to be done with reasons of efficiency or economy. So if you had a fleet of 100 Ford vehicles and you wanted to standardize on Ford, the board would have to be able to say, okay, we're going to standardize because for part stocking reasons and so on and so forth, we want to do that. So that's the kind of thing that I really haven't seen it done that often, but there may be opportunities where it makes perfect sense. That's also in the law. Okay, so we talk about penalties. What can happen if you willfully prevent competitive bidding? So I don't know that this has ever been enforced, because I would hope there's nobody out there that in this position who would, or any position for that matter, who would willfully prevent competitive bidding, but there are penalties for it, and it's covered under 103, can be subject to a misdemeanor charge and a penalty of not more than $1,000 and or 12 months in jail, which 12 months in jail doesn't sound horrible sometimes when you're having a rough day at work. So that's one way to get there if you're interested. Okay, bid mistakes. This is a good one. 103 says that the sole remedy for a bid mistake is to allow the firm to withdraw the bid. And there's caveats to that. There's certain conditions, because we know we can't allow somebody to correct a mistake. In other words, if they show up at a bid opening and say, "Oh, I meant to bid this price," well, that's too late. It's a material aspect of the bid, and really, it can't be changed. Period. If somebody forgets to sign a non-collusive statement, not considered a bid mistake. There's case law on this. You could allow them to sign that or fill it out or whatever needs to be done there. Again, all of these issues, if you feel comfortable, that's fine. If you don't, check with your attorney. Make sure he or she says, yeah, okay, that's fine. But generally, if it affects the material outcome of the bid, it's a mistake and really can't be changed. So here's the caveats. The mistake has to be made known to the awarding officer prior to the awarding of the contract. So after the fact is too late, or within 3 days after the opening of the bid, whichever is shorter. Okay, and these are all ands, the price was based on an error of such magnitude that enforcement would be unconscionable. Okay, so if they bid $20 for a vehicle that was supposed to be $20,000, certainly that's a huge error. And the bid was submitted in good faith, and the bidder submits credible evidence that the mistake was a clerical error as opposed to a judgment error, and the error is due to an unintentional and substantial arithmetic error or an unintentional omission of a substantial quality of work, labor, material, goods, or services made directly in the compilation of the bid. And the final one, it is possible to place the public agency, board, officer, or subdivision in status quo ante. And each case is going to be very specific to you and, may require you to consult your attorney. But the law, the bottom line is the law is very clear with bid mistakes. Sole remedy for bid mistake is to allow firm to withdraw entire bid, and entire emphasis on the entire bid. It's not just one line of the bid; it's the entire bid. Okay. So we move on to GML 104, and this is where we're given the authority to use the New York State Office of General Services contracts. In fact, I just got a question. Could we receive those conditions in writing? Maybe you could elaborate on that question a little bit for me, and I'll see if I can address it. But this is where the authority is given in 104 to use OGS, and I'm sure you've all used OGS contracts. OGS contracts are great most of the time, especially for compliance reasons. One could argue that pricing is not always the best on a New York State contract. But if you start to factor in administrative costs of doing your own bids and other administrative factors, it may be the best price. But certainly for compliance, I've always said when somebody says to me, yeah, but we don't get the best price. Well, you may not get the best price, but you're in compliance, and sometimes that trumps pricing. And again, that's individual case-by-case basis. Okay, this is where I showed you before, your local policy. General Municipal Law 104B talks about your local policy. And it talks about, here's what's required in the policy, as you see on the slide. Procedure to determine when competitive bidding is required. So basically that's your $10,000 and $20,000 limit, or if you've changed your policy, it's your $10,000 and $35,000 limit. It mandates that the policy must use verbal and written quotes. It doesn't tell you how many has to be verbal, how many has to be written. It kind of just says you have to use both verbal and written. And you've all seen, hopefully you all have a policy that talks about these thresholds that fall under the $10,000 and $20,000 or $35,000 limit, and some of them require verbal quotes for maybe under $1,000, or three written quotes for $5,000 and under, or any combination of those is fine, as long as you follow your own policy. Because what will happen is the controller, if you read through some controller's audits, you will see that the controller will often nail a district on not following their own policy. So you don't want to make it too restrictive. You want to make a policy that's easy enough to follow, but you don't want to make it too restrictive, because then you're bound to that. So keep that in mind when you're doing when you're making a policy or changing a policy. I have another question. Should language be stated in the policy or the administrative regs regarding online purchasing? And again, I'm going to assume online purchasing means using a credit card online. I'm going to guess. You would have a credit card policy to cover your credit card purchases, but still, you'd still have to follow your thresholds, and I hope that answers the question properly. But you still have to make sure your thresholds are followed, regardless of the method of purchasing or the method of funding. Regardless of the method of funding, all money is treated the same, and all has to follow your purchasing guidelines, which include the state purchasing guidelines as well. With the exception of, sometimes when you receive federal grants, there are additional restrictions or additional instructions that you must follow. I don't think at any time the feds intend to supersede any of the state laws, so you still have to follow the state laws, but then there may be additional requirements on top of that. So there's a further clarification on the question. Staples, Amazon, and Office Depot. It says we purchase online and then receive an invoice. We do issue a PO. So in that case, here's what I'm going to tell you. Staples and Office Depot, at least I know, are on state contract. So you could you could do a blanket purchase order and then draw off of that blanket purchase order from those online, because it's state contract and you really don't have to worry about thresholds. You just have to make sure the PO is cut before the order is placed, because then you're doing a confirming PO, which is frowned upon by the controller. As far as Amazon, I don't know what your dollar spend is, but again, it's you issue perhaps a blanket PO up to a certain limit and then cut it off. But it still has to follow the policy, of course, with the exception Staples and Office Depot being on state contract makes it much, much easier for you. Granger's another one, a big one we use here, where sometimes we issue blanket POs so that certain individuals can draw off of them if they need supplies, and other times we just issue POs directly for those items. Back to the policy mandates that the policy must explain when each is to be used. So again, you provide your dollar thresholds, and you say, based on your dollar thresholds, this is how many quotes we need. Requires documentation. Here's what I like to do. I like the policy to be just a little bit looser, not so restrictive, and then exceed the policy. And what I mean by that is, if you say for up to $2,000 or $3,000 you just need verbal quotes, that's fine for the policy, because then when you get an audit, they're looking at your audit and you're compliant because you're getting verbal quotes, hopefully. But I like to then, all of my users who are getting the quotes, because we're a little decentralized here, always get a written quote, regardless of the dollar amount, because it does several things for you. Because vendors have a funny way of billing more when it comes time to issue an invoice than they originally quoted you. And if you don't have something in writing, well, then you're out of luck, because you don't have any proof. It's he said, she said. So it's always good to have something in writing. And we find that a lot, especially with textbook orders, especially since most of you are schools. The textbooks seem to change a lot. I think it's McGraw-Hill that we have a lot of issues with, where they'll quote one price in writing, and then the invoice price will be different. All you got to do is say, hey, here's a copy of my quote, and they'll make the adjustment, no problem. So it really protects you too. And it also when the controller or whoever's doing your audits can go back and say, okay, they got quotes, and everything looks good. Also, you're required to document when the low bidder is not used. So I hope everybody, if they're rejecting a low bidder, they have either a letter to the vendor explaining or a letter to the file explaining why the low bidder was not used for whatever reason. If it's a responsibility issue, if you're going to declare them non-responsible, of course you have to provide them the opportunity to come in and speak to a committee or the board. It's called a responsibility hearing. But if they didn't, if they just bid the wrong product, or they didn't meet some kind of spec, then really you need to make sure that you have documentation either attached to your PO, either if it's electronically held, which is ideal, or in a file, or in your bid file. Okay. GML 102. Here's where, and any of you who've done construction projects, it says you can accept for payment as deposit not to exceed $100 for the return of plans. So if you ever worked with an architectural firm, they usually handle these bids for the schools. Just make sure they're following this rule, that they can't exceed the $100 cost for the return of plans. And the plans should be returned in good order in order to get their $100 back, but you can't charge more than that. it's 30 days following a bid award that they have to return it. Otherwise, the district can keep the money. Okay, let's go to General Municipal Law 109. Any of you who have come upon your own specifications and you necessarily didn't develop them, that they've been there, hopefully you see a clause that talks about no assignment can take place without the express written consent of the agency, so on and so forth. This is where it comes in. General Municipal Law 109 covers this clause and requires this clause right in your bid specifications, and it says that you can't assign. One person can't bid and then assign their contract to somebody else without your your written consent. It then releases, if somebody does that, it then releases your obligation to pay that contractor, with certain exceptions. I'll tell you what that is in a minute. If you find out that he assigned his contract, what you would owe him is exactly what is owed to his employees. So your lawyers would have to get involved and figure out what's owed to the employees, and then he would be out the rest of the money if he assigned the contract. Okay, General Municipal Law 801. It says, no municipal officer or employee shall have an interest in any contract with the municipality of which he or she is an officer or employee if he has the power to negotiate, prepare, authorize, or approve the contract and approve payment. So make sure you have some kind of clause to that effect in your bid documents as well. Because really you got to be careful that one of these persons is not involved with a contract that you let, even if there's no impropriety. Sometimes the appearance of impropriety is worse than is the worst thing. That's what you want to avoid, because as I said earlier with the headlines, newspapers are quick to pick up on issues related to school districts and the waste of taxpayer money. So we want to try to avoid that. All right, so another big one, besides 103 and 104, probably the third biggest, is New York State Finance Law, Section 162. And 162 defines preferred sources. And you've all heard of preferred source, I'm sure. The one that aggravates me, and I'll be honest with you, is Department of Corrections, Corecraft, because they're afforded they're afforded a preference with certain goods, such as furniture. And the problem with Corecraft is, I think personally, my opinion, is that their prices are high compared to market, and they're supposed to be in line with market prices. They also take an awful long time to ship. With that said, they are afforded status, so we do kind of have to go to them before we go anywhere else, as long as it meets form, function, utility, which we'll get to on a future slide here. Now, the ones I don't have a problem with, which I think are worthy programs, and legislature was thinking correctly, have to do with New York State Industries for the Blind and Disabled, and they provide work programs to individuals, handicapped physically or mentally, and blind individuals who otherwise probably wouldn't be able to work. So they do pay them and get them out of, if they're in group homes, it's a great program because it gets them out of the homes and helps them to become or to be productive members of society. They do have a lot of worthy products, worthwhile products, which are pretty competitive in market rates. In fact, if you've ever put a bid out for one of their products, if you have a good rep in your area, they will generally send you a letter and say, hey, can you consider us before you go ahead with the bid, or maybe they'll even bid. And in that case, and I'll get to that in a couple of minutes, there's a 15% differential when using those folks, but I'll get to that on the next slide. There's also veterans programs and programs for the mentally ill that are out there. And you'll see, you may even get vendors. There's some vendors out there that push recycled toners, refillable toners that the folks at the disabled do, I believe. Sure. And somebody just said, would you explain more what preferred source means? A preferred source is defined in the law by the New York State Legislature as exactly what the words are. It's a preferred source, which means, and let me go to the next slide to help explain that a little better. It's not forced. So in other words, what they say is that preference is afforded to these entities, and it lists exactly what I showed on this slide here. It'll list the Department of Corrections, the blind, disabled, veterans, et cetera, et cetera. but they're not forced. So in other words, you don't have to use them. You just have to give them preference over anybody else that offers that product, which is why if you use Staples is a good example. You may see if you use their pricer that's printed out, you'll see that some items are not available, and I think they even had a column in there where you check off, or they checked off, that it might be available from a preferred source, and that's why, because the state now does not allow them to sell some of the items to us because it would be competing with some of the preferred source programs. But again, basically the preferred source pretty much helps the disadvantaged individuals, which I think is a good program for them, not necessarily for the corrections, because I don't think they're disadvantaged by any means. Although if you're going to do an asbestos abatement project, they do have an excellent abatement program, so you don't have to go out and bid it. If you ever, you can always email me if you want the information, but you can contact Corecraft. They'll come out and look at your job, and they may bring prisoners in who are low-risk prisoners who they're teaching to go out into the workforce, and they do the abatement, and it really saves you lots and lots of money. And that's probably one of the best programs they do, and one of the ones I would say I support, just because I think it is pretty worthy. So again, products aren't forced. They have to meet form, function, utility. So if you want a wooden desk and they only can sell you a metal desk, well, it doesn't meet, form, function, utility test. So you don't have to buy it. You can challenge corrections pricing. There's a process listed, I believe it's on Corecraft's website. And basically, if you disagree with the pricing a price that they want you to pay, there's a process by which you can appeal their pricing, and you have to give them a certain amount of days to respond, and they can counter you, and it could take up to a month or two to get that rolling. So you kind of have to use your own discretion on that. With the other preferred sources, so these are anybody below on this slide here below Corecraft. There's a 15% price differential. So we talked about market rates of things. And if you, okay, I'm trying to get back to this slide here. I can't move my slide. I wanted to go back to the next slide. But if you, the 15% price differential, if you did a bid, let's say, okay, I just lost my, I'm sorry. If you did a bid and there was somebody lower than one of the preferred sources, as long as they were within 15% or not within 15%, you wouldn't have to take them. In other words, if the low bidder was 15% or was 16% less than the NICID price, let's say, you wouldn't have to take them. If they were within the 15%, you really should talk to them, because then the law states you really have to accept their bid, even though they're not the low, but they're within the 15%. So all kinds of good stuff related to that. Okay, so the next one is prevailing wage through the New York State Department of Labor. And if you need more information on this, we sometimes have run programs on prevailing wage. And if you reach out to your local Department of Labor office, which you can find on their website, it's probably just Google NYSDOL and it'll come up. You could always have them come out and talk to you or answer any questions. They're not out to get you. They're out to look for people who are out there who are hiring, say, day laborers and paying them way less than the working wage or even prevailing wage, really. So they're out there doing a service to make sure that there's work for everybody. So almost every public work falls under the auspices of DOL and needs to be reported. And the way you do that, and we won't get into it in detail today, but you generally go to their website and you fill out a PW39 form, which is very simple. You explain what the project is, when it's going to start, and they'll email you back a prevailing wage schedule, which then must be given to anybody who is quoting or anybody who's bidding your project. That's one of the requirements. And then there are two sections of prevailing wage which you have to know about, which are Article 8 and Article 9. Article 8 is a construction project. So, a building or a parking lot repaving, something like that. So you must report all those projects from $1. If you estimate it's going to cost $1,200, you have to file a report. If you estimate it costs $100,000, you still have to file a report. Article 9, which are building service contracts, which are trash removal, fuel oil delivery, window cleaners, things of that nature. If the project exceeds $1,500 in aggregate during your fiscal year, then it should be reported. Otherwise, it doesn't have to. So I know there's probably a lot of questions. We could do a whole seminar on prevailing wages, and maybe we even want to talk to Department of Labor to do something for ASBO because I think it would be worthwhile. But there's a lot involved with the prevailing wage, and basically your responsibilities are, as the municipality, are to file for the schedule, report who received the contract, and then make sure you have you receive the certified payrolls in order to pay the bills. Those are your only responsibilities. And again, they're not looking to bust the municipalities. They're looking more to, again, make sure these contractors aren't out there hiring day laborers and avoiding paying the proper wages. And when you get a prevailing wage schedule, you will get a list of debarred contractors who are people who have violated some section of the Department of Labor law and are now barred from municipal projects. So not a good idea to mess around with these guys if you're a contractor. So another law, New York State Ed Law 1725, it allows you to lease personal property. Okay, so a couple of caveats, because it's always a question. I think even Mary Ellen Clark has gone over this at a lot of the conferences, and you all remember her, who's now retired, and she had a lot of opinions, especially in this area. But you can do tree leases, and the leases should not, but may not exceed the term of the current school year unless considered an ordinary contingent expense. So ordinary contingent, we mean legal expenses, items necessary to maintain the educational program, preserve property, and assure the health and safety of students and staff. Ordinary contingent expense also comes in when you're doing a austerity budget, those types of things. And it also requires that the price of the lease be subject to bidding requirements. So if your lease is going to exceed $10,000, it does need to go out to bid, unless it's covered, of course, under county contract or state contract or something to that effect. Okay, and I believe the next slide, we're going to turn over to Angela. I think she's going to talk a little bit about when bidding or quoting is not required.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, I'm not sure if I'm going to get control of the slides, but I'll start anyway. When is bidding or quoting not required? And Mark has really gone over a number of these areas, but I'm going to get into a little more detail with them. And we'll start with the New York State contract. The New York State contract is, thank you, I have control now. The New York State contract is available to us as political subdivisions of the state, and I'm talking about schools and other municipalities that are political subdivisions of the state, and has a myriad of wonderful contracts that we can access, including contracts on school and art supplies, on library supplies. There's a list that's published on the site of all the commodity areas that the New York State does produce bids on. Some of them are highly technical and involved in computers and the technology behind a lot of high-level computer technology. The website for that, which we don't have on the slide, which I will give to people, is www.ogs.state.ny.us/purchase /default, DEFAULT.ASP. Now that basically gets you into the New York State OGS website piece, and from there you can navigate their website, which is extremely valuable in trying to search for either a commodity or a state contract number or a group that you're interested in buying from. And that gives us a whole lot of buying power that saves us from the time that's necessary to actually prepare a bid and send it out. And I know Mark had mentioned that he feels a 30-day window is a good time frame for bidding. Sometimes you don't have that, and I know many people in schools use a 2-week time frame from the time that the bid is sent out to the time that the date of opening, so that not only are we legally advertising it for 2 weeks, we're legally advertising it 2 weeks before the opening, but we also give the vendors what we feel most of the time works as enough time. Sometimes we would have construction contracts that were let for a little longer time and perhaps 30 days, but often it's a 2-week time frame. So in the New York State contract, once you go into their website, it allows you to use, as I said before, either words that you can then get hits on and pick what you think might be appropriate items to discuss or research, or a group number that is part of the way that the state organizes their information, and award numbers, which is also the way that OGS puts together their information. Now, in terms of BOCES contracts, there's a lot of BOCES are involved in cooperative bidding, and cooperative bidding normally is buy a subscription of some sort where a school district will either buy individual bids or buy the entire BOCES cooperative bidding and participate in that way. That gives us another realm of being able to purchase without having to do our own bid necessarily. And that cooperative bid purchasing is under GML Section 119. Something interesting on the county contracts is that, and a number of these preferred sources in county contracts are actually allocated law-wise by sometimes different laws, but all pointing to the same direction. New York State Finance Law 162 really also talks about county contracts, and as Mark said, any contract in the county, in any county in New York State, is going to be accessible. Again, you have to have that awareness that there's going to be a clause in their bid that allows you to, and most of the time it does not include, and it shouldn't actually by law include, prevailing wage schedule type services. And you'll see that information in General Municipal Law 103, Subdivision 3. In terms of New York State Finance Law 162, that's also going to cover in Section 184. 184 of State Correction Law talks also about CoreCraft. And I do agree with Mark that although CoreCraft does produce materials, and mostly what I'm thinking of, or there are a lot of desks and chairs and file cabinets that they do very, very well, but the lead time for purchasing is not usable in terms of getting the job done. So that, coupled with the fact that they can be quite expensive, I find that for my purposes, it's better for me to either look at another purchasing mechanism, either a New York State contract or a BOCES contract, and there are less and less New York State contracts, as the New York State OGS is pointing out, where preferred sources should be purchased from a preferred source, or your own bid, so that you can actually determine yourself whether you meet the 15% guideline, which in a lot of cases you really do. The cost of the desks and the furniture do exceed the 15%, and that's not a really good use of your funds. For the disabled and the blind organizations, again agreeing with Mark that that's a very good philosophy to follow. You should also be aware, in addition to what Mark said, that there are many times where their own requirements, especially in their packaging, may exceed what you need. So, for instance, if you're trying to buy film, and I think that's from the Department of the Disabled, a New York State Agency of the Disabled, you would find that they would sell it in 12 packs, and you may not need a 12-pack in your particular location. For many school districts who are decentralized, that issue becomes a problem because you don't have a warehouse, you don't have a place that you can stock it and then take it off a shelf. And I've had discussions with both agencies about that being an issue and that being a preventative for me being able to use them as well as we should.
Angela, let me add also that I think most of the time they have a $300 minimum order as well, so that's also stands in the way of some districts being able to put together a large enough order to use them.
Quite right, Mark, and actually as transportation costs have gotten higher and higher for delivery of a lot of goods, particularly for even school district bids, there seems to be a vendor movement towards higher and higher thresholds for minimums for deliveries to be qualified as free deliveries. And that's something that everyone in purchasing has to really take a real good look-see at and realize as they're going through their vendor relations that this is something that we need to work with vendors and try and make sure we pay people on time so that we can get things moved and they can continue to give us some of our more advantageous pricing. And in the area of the blind, you usually find brooms and brushes and wet mops and towels and pencils and that sort of thing, whereas the industries for the disabled are more of the ballpoint pens and picture frames and file folders. There are a fair amount of general supplies, and I also believe they do garbage, trash liners and that sort of thing too. But it's something absolutely to look into because you can find that there's some really very, very good materials that are available through those mechanisms, and you are doing the right thing by buying from a preferred source. In terms of an emergency purchase, emergencies, as you've seen before, are defined as very, very, very significant major issues. In the policy that had to be created as part of 104B many years ago, I believe in the 90s, districts, organizations, municipalities all had to come up with a stream of how to buy things when you're not buying off of a bid and at what thresholds you were making for those quotes to be done and whatnot. In the emergency purchase area, people have to remember it has to be very documented, and that if at all possible, it should be something that is sanctioned by your governing board. And in doing that sanction, you should be able to then still do your written or verbal quotes. And I agree. If you're asking a vendor to send you a quote, get it in writing anyway, and then you could continue and get your purchases done. But it doesn't forestall, having an emergency purchase doesn't necessarily forestall doing quoting. And you should look in your own entity's actual policy on purchasing to see how it's treated, so that if you are supposed to be getting quotes, even in that circumstance, you don't make a mistake by not, and then being cited by the state controller's office as a place that didn't follow your own rules. Sole source is also a little bit of a double-edged sword, because sole source is talking about really the only vendor in the world is this vendor for not only this item, but this type of item for the most part. Although you can standardize on a particular brand of an item, but you can't say that you want to get this particular light bulb and it has to be from this vendor because it's a sole source of this brand of light bulb. It has to be a sole source for acquiring it anywhere. And we run into problems sometimes in territorial areas where somebody will say, well, only this particular vendor sells this product in Nassau County from where I am, and so you can't get a custodial you can't get this brand of custodial supply from anybody else in the county. It doesn't mean that you don't spit it out, and it doesn't mean that you don't try and find it at another location that's not necessarily in the county. So you have to be kind of make a good judgment on how you're going to perceive what your sole sources are. If we do have a sole source, I ask for the manufacturer to put it in writing. We keep a file of those documents. We attach one to copies of purchase orders that are issued, so that they are available to any of the auditors that are interested in reviewing to see where that source of price came from. Second-hand equipment from another agency, we often hear that called surplus equipment, and there is no requirement for bidding that if you wish to acquire equipment from someone else who has it, who's willing to give it to you, or if willing to give it to you at even a price that you deem reasonable. The policy that is indicated in the, and I understand that there's actually a handout that was given or could be downloaded on this policy, is from Orange Ulster Boces, Compliments of Mark. And I just want to go over some key elements in it. It's fairly easy to read. It was meant to, this is the policy I alluded to before. It was meant to be a layman's policy that you could understand exactly what you were supposed to be involved in terms of your governing board's intent and how purchasing was going to be done in your entity. There are indications of what the bidding thresholds are to set the tone, but it is a policy that really was designed to talk about those items that were not going to be covered by a bid, and usually those items that were under the $10,000 threshold for goods and the now $35,000 threshold for public works. Normally in the policy there would be a component that would indicate in terms of a purchasing contract and a public works contract what the thresholds were to be, and in this case up to $1,000 on the purchase contract is at the discretion of the purchaser. From $1,000 to $3,000 is verbal or written quotes from two vendors. $3,000 to $9,999 written quotes from three vendors. That particular layout will differ in every single municipality that exists because everyone set their own policy for this. Same thing happens in the public works contract. This particular policy asks for verbal or written quotes from two vendors at the $3,000 to $10,000 mark. Sometimes it's asked for at different thresholds. But as Mark pointed out very early on, there's nothing that prevents you from either requiring written quotes, which do make sense and do protect you a lot better than a verbal quote would. And many vendors now, especially with the acquisition of email, which is from fax to email, those two devices really have allowed us to get things done very much more efficiently. And the vendors often really like to do it that way because it gives them their basis for knowing how they price something and a literal translation of what their offer is. And we are in the business of reviewing offers, and the more written material we have, I think, the better. There's also a clause that's pointed out in the policy here for BOCES that there are methods that we can use to not bid if we utilize the preferred sources and the state contracts and the counties correctly. I think the bottom line to almost all of this policy is documentation, documentation, documentation. Whether you're documenting using a summary form, the 3 or 4 verbal quotes you're doing, or the written quotes are summarized, or a reason that you're not going to be buying something from the lowest quoter because there is something that is not appropriate with their quote. Making sure that you have not only the component supply that you need, but the transportation charges. The transportation charges are absolutely always part of the buying scheme. If you're going to have a person doing quotes who doesn't add transportation costs or delivery costs in, they're going to be making an error, because many times you'll see that there's a vendor who is not the low bid who's chosen because their price for the particular good is lower than another's. And that should be reviewed every single time. I know on my summary sheet, which we use as a quoting sheet, I also request that people make sure I do a reminder to make sure they actually ask for a delivered price or the price of delivery separate so they can write it down on the sheet.
Can I add a couple things?
Please.
Okay. There's a question here. What is a written RFP? I know it shows up in the policy. RFPs, requests for proposals, and I believe we'll probably touch upon that in one of the next two sessions. And it's a little different than a bid because it's based on a set of criteria rather than just the lowest responsible bidder. Generally based on, it's generally written when you aren't sure how to define what it is you're looking for, or if you know what you're looking for, it has to do with other than price. Although pricing has to be a factor in that decision, but it can often require someone to have a certain level of experience or describe how they'll solve an issue, or be based on a number of different criteria, anything really you can think of. There is no set type of criteria you have to have in an RFP. And personally, in that policy, I don't like that it says for those thresholds to have a written RFP. I think quoting would be just fine, and when we update the policy to reflect the $35,000, we'll probably remove that. And it's interesting that you asked about the RFPs too, because there's a whole lengthy conversation on RFPs that, for example, professional services are exempt from bidding, and that's written specifically in the law. But if you look at a lot of the controller's audits over the last several years of districts, if someone picked a professional services provider without doing some sort of competition, namely an RFP, the controller's been writing them up for it. And in speaking with our own attorneys and other purchasing agents across the state, it's almost like the controller's now not doing an audit function but a legislative function as well, because it really doesn't say it in law that you have to do it. Although it's not a horrible idea, I can see the point behind it, but he's been nailing an awful lot of districts on it. And that's going to be one of the topics that when we talk about what is the controller going to look for in an audit, that's going to be one of the heavy-duty topics, because it seems like somebody told them to focus in on that.
Absolutely. And I know, too, that there's in many school districts, especially here on Long Island, we're very much focused on seeing what the state controller's office is involved in criticizing people about, and trying to adapt, because the state controllers have been very, very vocal about having concerns about how things are done and whether pricing is done with RFPs. And so one of the things that we've started looking at is actually trying to comply with that information, even though you're right, it's not in law. But of course, the state controller's opinion would have the force of law, and that hasn't actually been brought down yet, and so I don't know if that's going to ultimately be a something that the state controller is going to focus on to try and get some of that information legislatively looked at.
Correct. Let me also talk about, back to New York State Industries for the Disabled, one of the preferred sources. If you have one of their catalogs, there's a specific requirement to them that requires an entity to notify them first before doing certain projects. In fact, it's called giving them the right of first refusal. One of them that a lot of you would use and be pretty common to the schools is either document imaging or document processing, photocopying, reproduction, that type of thing. So if you're going out to quote it or bid it with an outside agency, you're by law bound to get a letter of release. Well, I shouldn't say that. You're bound by law to give them the right of first refusal. So if they decide they want to do the project, then you have to address it if they decide they want to do it. Generally, some of the projects we do are so much larger than they can handle. They'll generally give you a letter of release. So you're not looking for the letter of release, but if they can do the project, you really have to talk to them first. And they're pretty good to work with. And then one other thing, let me just answer this. So, Michelle asked, is there a centralized website where the products from the preferred sources can be found? I went out to the internet and found a document on the OGS website. It's called List of Preferred Source Offerings, and it's a 27-page book that lists all the preferred sources, and then it has a matrix with every commodity that is offered by the preferred source. And on the matrix, it has a check mark underneath the industry that supplies that entity. So if you go out to the OGS website that Angela gave you earlier, you can search for this document, List of Preferred Source Offerings. It's pretty easy to find. And that's all I have at this point. And if you want to go ahead.
Okay, thanks. So basically, you have your policy, you're documenting your information, you're following your policy. That's going to make a big difference in how your purchasing is perceived by people who are auditing you. Your auditors on premises are also probably going to give you feedback about whether the payments are being processed inappropriately for some reason. So you can use that as a part of what you build as your purchasing philosophy to make sure that your district is protected. And that could be your claims auditor, or it could be your external or internal controls auditors. So you have a lot of feedback from auditors, which I think most of you already know. Unless anybody has a question, and unfortunately I'm not getting questions at the moment. I just see the list of participants. So if there is a question on policy, please ask it either now or in the question and answer period. I'm going to go on to the next slide, which is basically the purchasing agent, which the Board of Education or the governmental agencies will appoint a purchasing agent. Most of boards of education do that annually at their reorg meeting. It is a requirement under the Commissioner's Reg, Part 170.2. Purchasing agent is the only individual permitted to commit district funds according to New York State Education Law, 1724, Article 1. But know that people forget that, and you sometimes have to remind them, sometimes very strongly, because they are not able to do that, including board members. Board members are not allowed to obligate district funds, and that's certainly something that has to be handled quite with a kid glove to make sure that you're getting your point across and dealing with your bosses in a way that won't get you fired.
And it's interesting too, because we recently discussed this question, because we have contracts that are being signed by other than the purchasing agent, and essentially committing the BOCES. But when I pulled the law yesterday, because we had I sent an email up to Jay O'Connor, who kind of gave me paraphrase the law. That just this, that the purchasing agent is the only one permitted to commit the district or commit district funds. If you read the law specifically, it says Union Free School or Central School District. It doesn't say anything about the BOCES or another type of a city school district or so on and so forth. So I'm wondering what the intent of the law was to only mention the union-free school districts as well as the central school districts. So we have another email going up to Jay to see if maybe he knows what the intent was or if he can clarify. But if you're a central school district or union-free school district, that is in fact the case, the way I interpret the law. If you're other than those two types of districts, it sounds like since it's not written, maybe anybody else can commit district funds as well.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you, both of you, Angela and Mark. And we do have a few questions and certainly encourage your questions. And I'm going to ask Angela to send to all the website. So, Angela, if you could, in the chat icon here, write down the complete website, send it to all, and then everyone will have it written for them. The first question, Janet Boyd actually has two of them, and the first one refers to the General Municipal Law 103, and she talked about the conditions. And Mark, you had asked her to elaborate a bit on it, and because all those conditions were hard to write down. Where would Janet find the conditions?
I'm still not certain which conditions we're talking about.
Okay, you were talking about a variety of conditions or even exceptions in General Municipal Law 103.
In 103?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm going to have to look back at my notes, Donna, but
Okay. All right. Well, while he's looking that up, we also, Janet had another question about a sealed bid. Can bids be accepted through email or through faxes? And if so, well, then how does it meet the sealed bid requirement?
I'll take that. I don't believe that it can be.
Okay.
Email.
Right, I agree.
Because they are not sealed bids, and the law quite clearly says sealed bids.
Okay.
So
I'm sorry. We actually have it written. Go ahead. I'm sorry. We actually have it written in our bid documents. No faxed or email bids are accepted. What you can accept is you can accept an online bid. However, the online bid has to be, usually it's through a service, has to be held in a repository that's approved by the state. This is recent law, probably in the last several years as well, that allows you to do this. And I know BidNet is one of the folks that offer the service. I don't know who's using it, if anybody's using it, but that is part of the law now. But generally you have to just receive your bids in a sealed envelope the old-fashioned way. There's no, because if you receive think about it, if you receive an emailed bid, you could open it prior to the bid opening, and the information potentially could leak out to other bidders, which would give somebody else an unfair advantage. So.
Right.
And that software is the technological answer to a lockbox. So, and the third party is keeping it secure. So there are I think there's some Long Island districts that are using BidNet. But as a school district, without having something very, very secure electronically, I definitely would not be involved in that.
Okay. Now, Michelle Reed has a question, and it says, in reference to bid mistakes, can you forward the list of certain conditions that you reviewed which allow withdrawal?
Yeah, we certainly can. If you have a copy of the McKinney's law book, it's in there in the 103 section. You can also find it on the internet if you do a Google search for GML 103, or we could send you some notes that include it as well. So if you don't have access to any of those resources, we could do that.
Okay. And, all right, I'm just copying down this website and sending that out to all of you.
Okay, Janet is clarifying on conditions for withdrawing bids. That's what the conditions were.
Okay. So where would she find that?
That's actually what I was just talking about to answer Michelle's question as well. It's the certain conditions to be met to allow an entity to withdraw their bid. I believe there's 5 of them. And again, they can be found right in GML 103, or I can just forward my notes. We have everybody's email address, Donna, is that correct?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So we could just do that.
Okay.
Donna, also there's something I wanted to just mention. I don't know that you had put it out there or not. I'm not sure you did. The purchasing handbook that New York State Education Department, the Educational Management Division, puts out has a lot of information that is covered. Some of it a little outdated because they don't update it quite as quickly as we do. And by the way, I wanted to also mention that the policy that is we were talking about at some length for each district should be looked at once a year and updated if necessary, and then the Board of Education should, adopt it.
Right, and in fact, there was a change to that law too. I believe biannually now. That
So I learned something too.
Yeah, we have to. The policy now needs to name, I believe, by name, the officer in charge of the responsible for the purchasing for the organization, and that just took effect, I believe, at the first. Well, time flies now. It's the 1st of January '09, I believe. So there's a new section in 104 which I'll have to research.
Yeah, I would like to have more information on that because I didn't know that.
Yeah. Now, I just sent out the website and, of course, made a typo. It's supposed to say /purchase/default, DEFAULT.ASP. So if everyone can make that change. And Debbie Pagano has a question. Currently, all contracts, maintenance contracts, etc., are being signed by our Assistant Superintendent for Business after being reviewed by our attorney. Should these now be signed by purchasing agents?
I'd like to take that, Donna.
Okay.
I think there's a difference between who signs the contract in the district and who signs the purchase order in the district. The purchase order, which commits the funds, specifically has to be signed by a purchasing agent. But if there's a contract, that a Board of Education, often the Board of Education president signs a contract or may delegate that to the business official or the superintendent of schools. At least that's been my experience.
Okay, well, thank you. And Michelle Reed has a question. Is there an event, such as inclement weather, that causes a school closing on the day of a bid? When would the bid opening be held?
That's a good question because we just had that issue. We were closed 3 days last week, and I had a bid opening scheduled for last Wednesday, I believe. Or last Wednesday or Thursday, regardless. At any rate, I issued an amendment, and that raises a couple of other questions, but I issued an amendment to extend the opening date until yesterday, Tuesday, which went out through BidNet to all the vendors, and we mailed it right away to those vendors who had picked up a copy without getting them on BidNet. So that raises the question also, there's a lot of debate over whether or not, if you change a bid opening date, if you have to republish it in the newspaper, and there's a lot of differing opinions. Some say no, some say yes. I did not in that case. Didn't have any issues, had plenty of bidders, had people show up. It was, you often can't predict the weather like that you would be closed. And the answer to that really probably it's probably something that we should send up to the state to get an opinion on, because I don't know the answer to that. If we're closed, go ahead.
In my experience, and we didn't, thank God, have to do that this particular year, but I found that school districts often will refer to their attorney and get guidance from them because there is no real guidance from SED. I would have done the same thing, Mark, as you did, except they probably would have faxed to the vendors the addendum so that they knew in advance that it was going to happen. I know there is a big issue going on in the state organization of municipal purchasing officials about the legality of doing that without a legal notice being put out there, and without allowing a vendor who submitted a bid to withdraw a bid if they wanted to do any last-minute change or whatever. And it's a really quite a tight problem, and I would run it to the attorneys and see what they had about it too.
Okay. And Laura Livemore says, can a bid be faxed to someone that wants a copy of a bid that is advertised?
Yeah, you can deliver the bid any way you want, email, fax, mail. But just know that you just need to track whoever has copies of the bid, because in order, if you need to issue addendums, you need to be able to contact those people. So your delivery is however you want to deliver it.
Okay. Anything else? This was a good volley of questions. And Angela or Mark, do you have anything else that you want to add?
I think we kind of scraped the surface a little bit, and I think that we'll get deeper into some of the issues on the next two webinars, and because you could really talk for days and days on a lot of these issues.
I absolutely agree, and I think as we get into more depth, I think some of the questions that will need to be answered make it even more complicated, because there are some real issues in purchasing, and some of it involves a lot of judgment.
Mm-hmm. And we have the hands-on purchasing webinar. It's going to be on March 15, and it is going to be a lot about bidding and writing specifications and contracts and so on. And then we have on March 24, we're going to talk about best practices, and that has a lot to do with the RFPs and the RFQs and some things to avoid. And we are going to talk about the comptroller's audits. So those will be part of the other webinars. Certainly a lot of information discussed, and hopefully you were able to take down the information and the various resources. If anyone has questions about any of those resources, we can get those to you. And those of you who are on the online course, if you will please then go to the conference room on the New York State ASBO website and click on online courses for purchasing, and your activities will be there. Any closing remarks that anyone has?
No, I'm good, Donna. We may have a new governor by the next time we meet, but
yeah.
I think
Oh, there's a lot going on here in Albany. Definitely, and not necessarily in the way that it should be going. Budget is due April 1st. Here we are on March 3, and no one's talking about it. So that's another issue at another time, and those are Steve Van Heusen's kinds of webinars. But thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to having you attend next time for the purchasing. Also want to remind you that we do have a webinar on March 9, and it's going to be on sales tax reporting. And then we also have one on March 16, and it's capital project final cost reports. So if you weren't aware of those are also going on. And appreciate your time, and look forward to having you join us for the next webinar. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes today's New York State ASBO webinar. Thank you for attending, and have a great day.